Philistines in the fall of 1981, and then he suspends them again when Begin extends Israel's law and administration to the Golan Heights, effectively annexes the Golan Heights. And Reagan used that as a violation of Security Council Resolution 242. So Reagan suspends weapons to the Israelis twice. That's not the low point of the Reagan administration. The low point of the Reagan administration is during the summer of 1982 with the siege of Beirut, when eventually the PLO is expelled, and then after they're expelled, the Israelis allow the Falange military, the Falange militia, to go into Palestinian refugee camp Sab and Shatila. And so, in many ways, the Reagan administration is among the toughest against Israel, and yet the Reagan administration is the administration that transforms the relationship. Starting in January of 1984, Reagan adopts a position, creates a structure called the Joint Political Military Group. This becomes the institutional umbrella for extensive security, military, intelligence, even economic cooperation with Israel. That kind of structure didn't exist before, and every president since Reagan has built on it, even if they didn't have an emotional attachment to Israel. Now, why does Reagan switch from being among the toughest, suspending arms shipments as a punishment? During the siege of Beirut in the summer of '82, he literally threatens the future of the U.S. Israel Relationship 5 times. Threatens the future of the relationship 5 times. His Secretary of Defense is pushing him to break relations with Israel. Weinberger wanted him to break relations with Israel. This is something usually we reserve for countries like North Korea, right? But Caspar Weinberger wanted to do that with Israel. Reagan goes back to his roots. Reagan does it because, you'll recall, we had our embassy in Beirut bombed in April of 1983, and then we had the Marine barracks bombed where we lost 241 Marines. And it's the Syrians backing Hezbollah, with the Soviets having rearmed the Syrians after the 1982 war in Lebanon, and he basically sees, look, these are our enemies, Israel's our friend, and he goes back to his roots. He goes back to his basic instinct. And he focuses again on building what is not just a relationship, a different kind of relationship with Israel, but a strategic partnership with Israel. And he represents what amounts to a fundamental turning point in the relationship. There's one other element that represents a turning point in his administration. I started by saying in every administration, from Truman to Obama, you've had a constituency that looked at Israel as being a problem. For the first time in the Reagan administration, you actually will see a constituency emerge, not individuals. A constituency emerge that sees Israel as a partner, not as a problem. Prior to Reagan, you would have individuals who would see Israel through the lens of being America's partner, being an asset to the United States. But they were individuals. They weren't a broader constituency. In the Reagan administration, what you see emerge is, in fact, a constituency. And since that time, different presidents basically decide between what is the interplay between these two constituencies. All right, I got a little bit more time, yeah?
Sure.
All right, so I got a little bit more time.
Yeah, I have a question.
We'll get into the question.
We'll get to the
Yeah,
question.
sure.
Right now, I'm still posing the question, but what I want to do is, in the time I have left, is to highlight for you 3 assumptions that have been embedded in the national security bureaucracy from Truman to Obama. They have lived on even though they should have been invalidated by reality. And I'm going to go through the 3. I'm going to give you a quick example of why they're fallacious, even though what you'll see when you read the book, in every chapter I go through and I give examples of these mindsets and why they were wrong. And you'll also see that there are echoes over time. When I go through this, even now, I'll bring it up to today again. Okay, so 3 assumptions, interrelated, that have been there from Truman on up until today. 1, if we distance ourselves from Israel, we will gain with the Arabs. 5 administrations do that. Eisenhower does it, Nixon does it, Carter does it, the first Bush does it, and Obama does it. The second assumption is that if we cooperate with Israel, we will lose with the Arabs. So if we distance from Israel, we'll gain. If we cooperate, we'll lose. And the third assumption is you can't transform America's position in the region, nor can you transform the region itself unless you solve the Palestinian problem. All right, so these three assumptions are there, and they live on. They have more weight in some administrations than others, but they're always there. Now, the first one, distance from Israel. I said 5 administrations distance from Israel, not one game. Give you, oh look, I can give you the example of Obama that I was using before. For the first 6 months of the Obama administration, there's conscious distancing, thinking we will gain with the Arabs, we'll gain with the Muslims. He inherited what he believed was a perception among the Muslims that we had been at war with them. So he had to change that perception, had to be the anti-Bush. And so he adopted his position on settlement. You had to have a complete freeze on settlement. He goes to Cairo to give a speech where he addresses really the narrative of the Arabs, but he doesn't address the narrative of Israel, and he doesn't go to Israel. And part of this is distancing with the expectation we'll gain, and of course we don't. I mentioned before, someone said Nixon when I talked about suspension of weapons. Nixon suspended F-4 Phantoms in the expectation that he could use that gesture as a way to get Nasser to respond to him. The great irony is the very moment he did it was at the time when the Soviets, for the first time in their history, were actually sending personnel outside the Soviet bloc to Egypt. And that's the moment that Nixon chooses to cut off the Israelis, expecting that he'll get a reward from Nasser. He sends his Deputy Secretary of State, Joe Sisko, to see Nasser, saying to him, look what a great thing we did. We stopped the arms to Israel, now you should respond to us. And Nasser, of course, what did he do? Well, let's see. I'll use a diplomatic term for him.
When did they learn?
He gave him buckets. So every time we made an effort to distance, we didn't get anything because we built a set of demands. We didn't present a responsiveness. All right, the second assumption. If we cooperate with the Israelis, we'll lose with the Arabs. So the first administration to provide arms to Israel is Kennedy. Truman doesn't. Eisenhower doesn't. Kennedy does it. And Kennedy provides what are purely defensive weapons. Hawk anti-aircraft missiles. They're not mobile, they're fixed. The only thing they're good against is planes that are attacking them. Now, it causes a tremendous debate within the administration that is contemplating this. I won't go through the cables that were coming from our ambassadors saying how the sky would fall if we did this. The language they use is actually, some of it was so extreme that it almost made me laugh because it was literally ludicrous. But the leader of the effort against the president doing this was Dean Russ, the Secretary of State. And Russ says that if we provide these weapons to the Israelis, it'll set a terrible precedent and it will cause grave damage to our relationship with the Arabs. Grave damage. Okay? Now, as luck would have it, the day the news of the sale to the Israelis came out happened to be the day that Russ was meeting the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia in New York for the opening of the UN General Assembly. And the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Faisal at the time, was really the real leader of Saudi Arabia. So here's Russ who thinks having done this is going to cause grave damage to our relations with the Arabs. So when he walks in to see Faisal, does Faisal give him the diplomatic equivalent, or say the diplomatic equivalent of, you're dead to me? No, that's a rhetorical question. No, what does he do? He doesn't even raise the sale to the Israelis. What does he raise? He raises the coup in Yemen that has been backed by Nasser, which he identifies as being an attempt by Nasser to gain a foothold in the Arabian Peninsula to threaten Saudi Arabia. And he not only wants us to counter that, notwithstanding the fact we provide arms to Israel, he wants arms from the United States, he wants assurances from the United States. All right, so a week later, he goes to see the president at the White House. So maybe in the intervening week, he's come to his senses, right? He's realizing, my God, I missed this opportunity to complain about the weapons of Israel. I have to go in and complain about the weapons of Israel and how it's going to damage what we can do with you. We can't do anything with you. Is that what he does when he comes in to see Kennedy?
No.
Is that what he's poised to do?
No.
Pregnant pause. No. What does he do? He doesn't raise it again. What does he raise?
Saudi Arabia.
He talks about the fact that we are enabling Nasser. One of the things the Kennedy administration has done is to provide economic assistance to Egypt. We are providing 2/3 of Egypt's bread supply. And Faisal comes in and says, your outreach to Egypt, the resources you are providing Nasser are freeing up resources for him to threaten all your friends in the region. He is changing the balance of power because you are enabling him to do it. What we need from you is to stop that, support us, provide us time, give us assurances. Now, does that sound familiar to you? Have you heard something like that?
Iran.
If you substitute the word Iran for Egypt, that's exactly what the Saudis and the Emiratis and others have been saying for the last 2 years. What does this reveal about the real priorities? The notion that it's our relationship with Israel is what guides the behavior of Arabs towards us reflects our reading of a situation that doesn't exist. The reality is that for the Arab leaders, their priority is security and survival. Who threatens that? Their regional rivals. In the 50s, in the 60s, it's Nasser. In the 70s, it's Gaddafi. Later, it's Saddam Hussein. Now it's Iran. They don't focus on Israel. I'm not saying they like Israel. I'm not saying they love our relationship with Israel. But they will never make their relationship with us dependent on what we do with Israel because they look to us to provide their security and their survival, and that's their priority. I started by talking about ISIS. What's their priority today? It's not ISIS, it's Iran. The reason they don't join us is because they're focused on Iran. We're not focused on their priority, we're focused on our priority. In every administration, when we misread things, which unfortunately has been very often, it's because we have misread what are their priorities. If you want to get well in this region, you better focus on what are their priorities and then figure out whether those priorities are compatible with ours. All right, I'm going to wrap it up with 2 sets of comments. I didn't talk about the third assumption. The third assumption was you can't transform our position in the region or the region itself unless you solve the Palestinian issue. For a long time, even when I was in, I would raise questions about this. Not because I don't want to try to solve that issue. I've spent the last 30 years trying to solve that issue. But I never wanted or tried to solve it because I thought if we solve this, it changes everything in the region. I never believed it was a game changer in the region. I believed it was important to solve on its own merits. I still believe that's the case. I'm worried if you don't do something, even if you can't produce peace right now, I'm worried if we stay where we are, Israel will become a binational state. So there are reasons why I will continue to work on this issue, but not because it will change the region. You know, what seems, or should seem obvious to people today, although I will tell you it still doesn't completely penetrate, is that if tomorrow, since I'm standing in a shul, if tomorrow the Mashiach arrived, and this is what it will take, produce peace between Israelis and Palestinians. If tomorrow that happened, would it stop one barrel bomb in Syria? Would it push ISIS back 1 meter? Would it change the existential struggle between General Sisi, President Sisi in Egypt, and the radicalism that he's contending with? Would it end the proxy war in Yemen? Would it change Iran's aspirations in the region? These are also all rhetorical questions. There's a value in dealing with this, but not because it's a game changer in the region. Now, the title of the book is called Doomed to Succeed. Obviously, there's a sense of irony in the title. I've given you just a taste of the ups and downs of the relationship throughout time of Israel's existence until today. The relationship has evolved in a certain direction because we do share values, we share interests, and we share threats with Israel. One of the reasons I remain optimistic, even though when you see in the last chapter I identify certain alarm bells, and we can talk about that if you want. One of the reasons I'm basically optimistic about the future of the relationship, even in difficult times, is because the region, as you look at the region is going to be characterized by a terrible struggle, terrible conflict, terrible violence for at least the next decade and probably for the next 20 years. And the reason for that is because the conflict is over identity. And who is going to define it, who is going to shape it, who's going to own it. You have a struggle between radical Islamists, Sunni and Shia. You have a struggle between radical Islamists and non-Islamists. A proxy wars you see are really a function of that. That's what makes the violence so terrible. Now, as you look at that, and as people look at that, as you look at a region characterized by turmoil over the next 10 to 20 years, there is one state in the region that may have problems, but it has a set of institutions. One state. One state that has a rule of law. One state that has a separation of powers. One state that has an independent judiciary. One state that has freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, a vibrant civil society. One state. One state where women's rights are respected. One state where gay rights are respected. One state where there are regularly scheduled elections and unregularly scheduled elections. Where the loser accepts the outcomes. One state. That one state is Israel. It has the ability and the institutions to deal with its problems. Its problems are real, with Israeli Arabs, the religious secular divide, but it has the means to respond. Like most democracies, it may not always do it in a linear direction. It may do it in a somewhat messy direction, but precisely because it has real institutions, it can cope with its problems in a way that no other state in the region can. And that's the reason that the book is entitled Doomed to Succeed. Thank you.
Either fortunately or unfortunately, Ambassador, you've answered most of the pre-prepared questions I've had, so I'm going to have to innovate on the spot. I want folks to start thinking of questions that you might want to ask, and we're going to have some folks go around with microphones. We're going to ask that they are questions and not declarations, and go from there. But I want to start off by first asking you one question, Ambassador. In your book, you make it very, very clear. You spend your entire book and is attempting to debunk these three myths. The question is, if these myths, and I think you thoroughly do so, about Israel, if you go closer to the Arab descendants from Israel, vice versa, about the centrality of the Palestinian as the central interest in the Middle East. And the bottom line is, if it's so, I think in the question coming, if it's debunked and it's so obvious, why does it continue?
Well, first, one of the reasons I wrote the book was to expose this. Because obviously, when I've been in administrations, I lived with this, even when I was in senior positions. I could win arguments, but somehow these assumptions wouldn't go away. So I decided to write a book, mostly for the next administration, to expose this, to show this. Not to make an argument, but to demonstrate it over time. To show it in every administration, to show how these assumptions were there and how they were belied by reality. You know, when I go and I tell policymakers now, and I give them the Kennedy example, and I say, what's changed? I mean, you have this exact same, reality. You know, they're surprised, they didn't know it. So sometimes when you're dealing with assumptions that take on a life of their own, you are also dealing with a reality where there's no introspection, where there's no serious lessons learned, where nobody asks the question, well, gee, we thought this was going to happen and it didn't. Why not? So I wanted to...
Why do you think that serious introspection doesn't take place? Why don't?
Because the nature of the policy process, to be fair, you're hit with 1,000 things a day.
Right.
You don't have time to sit back and reflect. When you make a decision and you go to the next thing, there's very rarely a post-mortem. The only ones who do post-mortems are the military, and they don't do it on the policy, they do it on military operations. You don't have serious lessons learned in the intelligence community. Instead, they're always looking for the next problem. So in a sense, you don't have the kind of perspective that might allow one the ability to sit back and say, you know what? We've been accepting this assumption, but it's fundamentally flawed.
And you add that to the theory that you advanced in your first paragraphs of the last chapter of your book. You said that every administration feels they have to undo or redo what happened in the previous, and then you have and that plus with those competing assumptions, you've got a dangerous cocktail for going forward.
Well, think about it. At the political level, people come in and they don't know the history at all. At the bureaucratic level, where these are the assumptions that they live by, because they've taken on the aura of mythology. You know what a mythology is? A mythology is something that is not true, but it is taken as true, and it can't be questioned.